So, welcome to the Classic Ghost Stories podcast course on Dracula. There'll be 5 lessons, and this is just intended to enrich your enjoyment and understanding of the book Dracula by Bram Stoker to accompany our audiobook or my audiobook recording of it. So, this is lesson 1. So my name's Tony Walker and I'm the narrator of the Classic Ghost Stories podcast, and in case you didn't know, I usually, after recording a story, I give an exposition about the author, their work, the story itself, the current climate and any other influences on it. Now, with the longer audiobooks such as Dracula, I haven't done that because it's like 14 hours long, and so by the time I'd finished I was very tired. So I thought I would do this kind of add-on course to help enrich your enjoyment of it. So let's say something first of all about Bram Stoker and his era. So Bram Stoker was born in Dublin in Ireland in 1847. During his early years in Dublin, Stoker was immersed in a vibrant literary and theatrical scene. For 12 years he worked as a civil servant in Dublin Castle, a role that provided him with stability at the same time as he pursued his literary interests. It's the same thing as Kafka did the same. He worked as a clerk while he was writing, and this is the case of many writers before they become famous, or even some of them don't become famous and they have to stick to the day job. Stoker also worked in his spare time as a theatre critic for the Dublin Evening Mail, a newspaper that was co-owned by Sheridan Le Fanu, the renowned Irish Gothic writer who, in the context of Dracula, Stoker and Dracula, Le Fanu was known for his vampire novella, so it's not a full novel, but still quite long. Carmilla narrated that, of course. You can listen to that on the Classic Ghost Stories podcast. Carmilla was published in 1872. So, Stoker would have been familiar with it and familiar with other vampire literature, such as Varney the Vampire, the great Penny Dreadful, that was about 720,000 words that came out week after week after week during the 1840s and 50s. It's probably not the case that he knew Sheridan Le Fanu personally, because he was only 26 when Sheridan Le Fanu died in 1873. However, in many ways, Carmilla, if you read Carmilla, you can see a direct progression to the kind of vampire that we're seeing in Dracula. Anyway, in 1876, Stoker left Dublin and he went to work in London, where he became the personal assistant to the famous actor Henry Irving. So Henry Irving in his time was like a big Hollywood celebrity. He was very well known. But of course, he used to tour around and Stoker would tour with him. So Stoker became the business manager of Irving's Lyceum Theatre. And he did that job for nearly 30 years. And this placed Stoker at the heart of London's theatrical world, exposing him to dramatic storytelling, well, stories in general, but also stagecraft. Because one of the big things that happened earlier, century earlier almost, or 80 years earlier, was Matthew Lewis wrote one of the great Gothic novels, The Monk, which was full of shocking detail. And that was in the 1790s. Matthew Lewis also worked in theatres in London, and he pioneered a lot of stagecraft, the Gothic stagecraft, because Gothic lends itself to the tricks and trade, the lighting, the sound effects, pyrotechnics if possible, So you can see that Gothic is very closely related to the stage and drama. It's very dramatic, it's over dramatic, its critics would say. In any case, so what we're saying potentially is, although Stoker didn't produce Dracula as a play, he was very aware of stagecraft. During his time moving round, Stoker spent several summer holidays in the coastal town of Whitby, and these in North Yorkshire. These visits had a profound impact on him, and the town would later feature prominently in Dracula. This is where Dracula comes to land, and if you think about it, there's no real reason why Dracula, who later goes to London, there's no real reason why Dracula should come to Whitby, except it's a dramatic place, and Stoker was very fond of it. And it's one of my favourite places in the world, Whitby. And if you've never been, you should go. I haven't been to all the places in the world, but Whitby's, of the places I have been, Whitby is pretty good. And Whitby, funnily enough, has its Goth Festival, 2 Goth Festivals a year. It has the Dracula Experience, which I've been going to on and off for 30 years, no, Yeah, going on. Yeah, going on 30 years. I don't go every year. And the bookshop has a lot of Gothic books. So Whitby kind of lives off not only its Gothicness, because it has the Whitby Jet, it has Whitby Kippers, Whitby Fish and Chips. It has a lot going for it. I'm not even paid by the Whitby Tourist Board. But anyway, so he has Dracula coming into Whitby, which had a great effect on the future prosperity of Whitby because of Dracula. Dracula is said to be the most influential horror novel ever written. What would be the second? The Shining, maybe? Something by Stephen King. You know, your views are your own in that. Okay. So Dracula was published in 1897 and wasn't initially successful, yet success built over the years. Let's talk about some themes now. So, Victorian anxieties. The Victorian era was rife with anxieties that profoundly influenced literature of the time, including Stoker. These anxieties were primarily driven by the rapid advancements in technology and science. Think about what our own age is going to produce with the rapid advance in technology and AI, as well as the expansion of the British Empire. You could say in the 1890s, the British Empire was at its height and went into decline after the First World War, or certainly after the Second World War. The Industrial Revolution, 18th and 19th centuries, happened first in Britain and was profound in the effects it had on society in Britain. It brought all these inventions like the telegraph, the steam engine, electric lighting, such transformations. No longer did we have to, and a lot to be said about the ghost story. People said with electric lighting there would be no more ghost stories. They were wrong, but there's a big difference in candle lit houses and electric lit houses. So we see other writers such as H.G. Wells talking about, like in The Time Machine, 1895, 2 years before Dracula. There are all sorts of profound things going on. He travels to the, I've done this as well, of course. He travels to the distant future and finds humanity divided into two species. Interestingly, the subterranean species are monstrous. There's something almost, and they're cannibals. So there is, if you haven't, that's a spoiler if you haven't read it. There's something vampiric about them, really. So, and then we have scientific theories coming in, Darwin's theory of evolution, challenging traditional religious beliefs, and the very understanding of human nature. And so we have this conflict between science and faith, or the implications of science, in the strange case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Now, Jekyll is the actual Scottish pronunciation, so don't comment on that, because every time I say Jekyll, I get all these. It's like nearly as bad as Bowie, David Bowie, David Bowie, David Bowie. Come on, peace. So that came out in 1886, so like 11 years before Dracula, but again a classic Gothic. The expansion of the British Empire led to increased contact with foreign cultures. In many cases, before the communications of the late 18th and 19th century, rather, most people had no contact at all with foreign cultures. As communications improve or get faster, the world starts to open up, and the differences in the world. And I think we've reached a stage where there has been a homogenization of the world, whereby if you go to Singapore, you go to Buenos Aires or Dublin, yeah, the weather's a bit different, but otherwise things are relatively similar. Whereas I think in the 1890s, even relatively close places to Britain, and I'm thinking of like Eastern Europe, even Central Europe. I mean, Transylvania technically is, yeah, Central Europe, is very, very different, and there was a fascination with it, but also a fear of it, a fear of the other, the alien, the different. And so the fear of the foreign or unknown is central in many other Victorian novels. And I'm just talking about other Victorian novels to give you a flavour of what was happening at the time, because Dracula itself was not written in a vacuum. It is a product of its time and place. So think of Rider Haggard's She, one of my favourite films. The book came out in 1887, whereby the protagonists go to this ancient, powerful, and dangerously alluring queen in Africa. So the fascination and the fear of the exotic. I should say that perhaps the fascination with the Oriental and the African was innocent, in that is a curiosity, but it has been. There's a guy called Edward Said who wrote a book called Orientalism, came out in 1978, and that looked very darkly on the West's playing with Eastern cultures. So, these are complex things. So, as well as the the foreign threat to British civilization, or uh, the Oriental threat to, even though Transylvania is not very Oriental, to Western civilization as a whole, there is this idea of degeneration, and we see this, of course, in the Time Machine very classically, how the future is seen to be degenerate. The idea that humanity could regress rather than progress. So you have Darwin's idea of a progression, but we as humans seem to see ourselves as the top of the pinnacle. But there was all, and we were everything was going to get better. This idea of progress, which is built into sort of capitalism, really. Progress, growth. We hear it all the time: growth, growth, progress, progress. Whereas this idea that we could regress, and this was very much as the perhaps an unspoken fear. No, it wasn't unspoken. Somebody would have spoken about it. But in the general psyche of the times, in Victorian Britain, things were on the up and up. The British Empire was expanding, trade was expanding, wealth for certain people was expanding, and there was progress. At the same time, we worried about bad things. The Victorians were very worried about the criminals and the lower classes as a kind of a Untermensch, really, as a subclass. They call that the underclass, don't they? They call it now. And so these appear in many Victorian novels. A lot of Sherlock Holmes villains are a bit like this. And of course, we have Jack the Ripper in the back end of the 19th century. The fascination with the low life of the East End. So the other isn't just foreign; it's local, but of a different class. It's the underclass. So this idea of degeneration, that we could degenerate, and the third theme, really, the first two being the foreign other, the second being the fear of degeneration, and the third is the changing roles of women, anxieties about gender and sexuality, this idea that women should know their place and be in the kitchen, etc. And this is challenged, this is changing. Lots of women go out to work. I did a story written by a woman called Lily Harris, who was an investigative journalist in the 1880s and went into Whitechapel in the East End when the Ripper murders were happening as an investigative journalist. So you think these are modern things, but they're not. There wouldn't have been many people like Lily Harris, but this is what happened. They did exist. So women were coming into the workplace. And this is, of course, related to, and listen, I don't want to be controversial, but there has been a centuries of control of women's sexuality. The woman, the wife, the daughter, the mother need to be protected and kept away from rapacious males. These are my females. I'm going to look after them, and you keep away from them, you filthy dog. And in this we have Lucy, of course, and she is transformed into a vampire, but she's becomes, in a sense, lewder, an increased sexuality playing, and this perhaps plays on these fears about female sexuality. We have it, of course, in Carmilla as well, very much so. So we have these three anxieties, and there's probably more, entwining in Dracula. We see them all in Dracula. Let's say something about Gothic literature, just to set the scene for the kind of story that this is. So these anxieties often found expression in Gothic literature. It emerges in the mid-18th century. In the 1865, I think, is The Castle of Otranto by Horace Walpole, said to be the first Gothic novel in English. I mean, there are things happening in French and German as well, and later in Russian. This is 1760, 1765, and then we have the flowering of Gothic in the 1790s with Anne Radcliffe, who introduces not just Gothic horror, but Gothic romance, very important, and the protagonist tends to be a woman in that case. And then it never really goes away, because in the mid-1800s, 100 years after the Castle of Otranto, we have Varney the Vampire, we have Sweeney Todd, in the very common penny dreadfuls for the mass market, really. But then we have this, as we saw, Jekyll and Hyde, Frankenstein's 1818, so it never really goes away, but it flowers again in the later part of the 19th century. So It serves as a perfect vehicle for exploring societal anxieties and the darker aspects of human nature. Gothic literature is characterized by several key elements: exploration of the dark side, said that, use of the supernatural or inexplicable elements. So it's not realist, gloomy and atmospheric settings, emphasis on emotion, particularly fear and terror, and complex, often morally ambiguous characters. So I want to contrast it with, in the 18th century, there was the realist novel. It was felt that novels should not contain improbable things, and they should be edifying. They should be teaching people how to behave. And then the Gothic came along and didn't do any of this. It was not edifying. It was sensationalist. It played on thrills, and it was very much looked down on. But it touched our or their society's craving for a touch of the supernatural, a touch of the awesome in the original sense of the things that create awe, which are often the sublime, fear, or, those feelings. At the same time as the Gothic, we have the romantic, Wordsworth, Coleridge, Goethe, Schiller, and the, they also were looking for the sublime, and they tended to find it in nature. Think of Wordsworth, and in a sense, they're twins. The romantic novelists and writers look down their noses a lot on the Gothic as being for common people and for the masses, but they're both driven by a quest for the sublime and the awesome. Just that the romantic tends to look at the light side, the wonder and the beauty of nature, and the Gothic looks at the dark side, fear, terror, and I actually think you have to have both to have a complete. The world is not completely light, as if you just look around you, you'll see that, but neither is it completely dark either. So I think the Gothic gets a lot of stick from people who consider themselves superior in literary tastes and writers and readers and critics, but I think it's got a lot to offer. But then I would, because I like it. So in Dracula, we have the ancient and isolated castle. In Gothic stories, there's usually a castle or an antique or antiquated building, could be a monastery. Later on, that becomes a mansion house. In American Gothic, the Southern Gothic plantation house, and we have the New England Gothic, whereas these old, again, colonial style houses, I mean, think of Lovecraft, but also people like Henry James and Edith Wharton are not above using that New England Gothic building. And then later on in the 70s and 80s, it becomes kind of the suburban house, but it's built on a burial ground. I know that's been criticised, that trope as well. Anyway, at the same time as all this is happening in literature, where we have the ancient isolated castle Dracula, Count Dracula as the mysterious, alluring and dangerous villain, the sense of impending doom, the exploration of forbidding desires and repressed sexuality. Think of Jonathan Harker with those Three Brides of Dracula. He's a little bit titillated there. So, and the conflict between ancient superstition and modern rationality. That's almost another theme as well as the ones we talked about before. Reason versus unreason. And that is present in the Romantic and the Gothic as well, versus the rational, if you like. And also at the same time, it's in buildings as well. There was the late Victorian Gothic or Neo-Gothic became highly fashionable for both public buildings and private residences, characterized by pointed arches, steep gables, ornate decorations, and an emphasis on vertical lines. Victorian Gothic architecture, can't speak, sought to evoke the mystery and grandeur of medieval Gothic structures. Notable examples include the Houses of Parliament in London, designed by Charles Barry, and Augustus Pugin, and St Pancras Railway Station. Fantastic buildings. Been restored now. Wonderful building. So this is the same fascination with the past, the mysterious and the dramatic that we find in Gothic literature. The final thing to say in this lesson is to look at the structure of Dracula, because it's an epistolary novel. It's not the first one. For example, Frankenstein is also an epistolary novel. It's hard to say. Epistle, which just means letter. Think of the epistles of St. Paul. So it presents the story through a collection of documents, and these include diary entries, letters, telegrams, newspaper clippings, and even phonograph recordings. Think of Dr. Seward. This fragmented approach to storytelling creates a mosaic-like narrative, with each point of correspondence or journal entry providing a unique perspective on the unfolding events, gradually building a complete picture of the story. The epistolary structure allows for multiple narrators, each with their own distinct voices and viewpoint. So we can see something in one, or an emphasis in the second, that isn't in, and it enriches it. And it helps us with one of the really important things that a writer does is he balances, or she balances, the amount of information the audience has. How much do you know as the reader or listener? And that withholding of information creates mystery, creates suspense, potentially creates dramatic irony. And this structure allows that. They've all got the distinct voices, so you have Jonathan Harker, Meenan Murray, Lucy Westenra, Dr. Seward, and others presenting the story through their personal documents. And we have this sense of immediacy. They're writing often what's happened today, boom, or a telegram or something like that. So we're right there. And it also allows the unreliable narration. How much can we trust each of these people to give a true account? Or is it subjective? Is it biased? Is it corrupted? So, and he uses it to control the pacing and build tension. We just talked about that. That's about balance of information. How much information? Because the craft of a writer is to raise a question in your mind and not answer it immediately. And the more questions we can keep running and not answering and putting off. Now, there comes a point where you're bored by it and go, no, I'm not into this anymore. But if you time it right, like he does, you raise a question, you don't answer it immediately. You create suspense. The reader wants to know what's going to happen. Then you answer it, but at the same time, you raise another one. And also the use of contemporary communication, so letters, telegrams, newspapers, and of course the phonograph. I think it's a wax cylinder, isn't it? I forget now, but it grounds these fantastical elements in the real world of the late 19th century England. M.R. James, a later generation of ghost story writer, talked about how a ghost story to be successful, or a horror story, or a story that contains improbable events, has to be at a certain distance. So it has to happen in the past, or in a foreign country, or somewhere that isn't like just down your street, because you're going to say, well, that's not going to happen down my street. But at the same time, if it's too distant, it isn't connected. So he puts it in Transylvania and in London, but he also uses modern, contemporary communication or technological devices to make it real. And another thing about writing is you can always improve your writing by using a detail. Don't do too many of them. So, modern writers put brands in. So, but it's not just a teapot. It's a brown Clarice Cliff teapot. And it's not just a cigarette. It's one of those Russian coloured cigarettes. I've forgotten what they're called now, but you know what I mean. I've just ruined that. But if I was writing, I'd find out. So anyway, that is a bit of a run through of the first lesson of the Dracula course. And remember, there will be more lessons to come, and I will send you them.